Come, imagine with us.
Can and may we, in present-day Berlin, imagine a Middle East unified in peace and equality?
Across national borders and religious and lingual divisions.
With literature, discourse, and music.
Cinema, performance, poetry, special feminist and queer discussions.
The 4-day Middle East Union Festival, with guests from all over the world, makes this vision seen within reach and invites you to freely explore ideas of utopia.
Come, imagine with us.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us at the Middle East Union Festival. We are very delighted to have a very exciting panel today that's going to talk and view this idea, what will happen after censorship. We have 3 guests today. I will introduce one of them and you will introduce the others. I will start with a description of the panel. After years of censorship and limited movement of literature between borders, how do you write again when everything is suddenly possible? What forbidden memories may rise in such historical moment? What is the possibilities for a flow of literature without borders and censorship? What are the interactions which will be created in this new cultural space and political structure of the Middle East Union? I'm very glad and happy to introduce Dr. Amro Ali. He's a writer and sociologist at the American University in Cairo, a member of the Arab-German Young Academy of Science and Humanities, visiting fellow of the Forum Transregionale Studien and the Berlin Graduate School Muslim Cultures and Societies at the Freie Universität Berlin. Ali received his PhD in political sociology and political philosophy from the University of Sydney. In the panel, you can write us your questions and remarks in the Facebook event of this panel, and we will take the questions and introduce them to the panel before the end. And Amro, please, you can start.
Thank you, Matti. Thank you so much. I first have to say congratulations on this organization, the Middle East Union. I have been following it up, and it's really fascinating. I like how what we discuss in theory over coffee or in workshops can actually be actualized in Berlin. And the topic is really critical and really topical, in fact, because we're dealing with a new reality being in Berlin and what it means when our previous lives, what it was in the Middle East and what it is now in Berlin. And all of a sudden we have these options and freedoms and things we're not used to. And that raises very important questions about creativity and how do you deal with post-censorship, or are we dealing with a different form of censorship? It's a very, very big question that we will unpack throughout this discussion.
Thank you. Berlin, I'm going to be in the background, so the panel is all yours.
No problem. Thanks, man. So so Berlin, as we say, is a place for new beginnings, and I've written on this matter a while ago, and it's something I do have a conviction about, that I do see a political promise that can come out of Berlin. Because as we know, when it comes to matters of the Middle East, the status quo no longer makes any sense. And we're thinking now in much more imaginative and utopian ways of dealing with our heritage and questions that are linked to our personal lives back home and our loved ones. Now, we have 2 brilliant thinkers today with us. We have Orit Baskin. Hello.
Hi.
I would like to introduce Orit. So she's a historian who works on the intellectual, social, and cultural history of the modern Middle East. She's got her PhD from Princeton University, and she wrote her thesis on Iraqi intellectual history, I believe, and under the supervision of Professors Robert Tigno and Samah Salem. She's a professor of modern Middle Eastern history in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. Her publications, very impressive, have included 40 articles and book chapters that deal with Iraqi history, the history of Iraqi Jews, the Arab cultural revival movement, particularly with a focus on the Nahda, and in the late 19th century, and the connections between modern Arab history and Arabic literature. And she has produced a series of books, Impossible Exodus, Iraqi Jews in Israel, by Stanford, and New Babylonians, A History of Jews in Modern Iraq, and The Other Iraq, Pluralism and Culture in Hashemite Iraq. So congrats on that in hindsight as well. Nael Eltoukhy, I am familiar with Nael, although we have yet to meet. Someday we will meet, inshallah, Nael. It's strange that we live in similar places, but we never meet. So Nael is well known in Egypt and abroad. He's an Egyptian novelist, an essayist, and journalist, and he's a translator of Hebrew literature into Arabic. He's based in Cairo. He has published 2 novellas and 3 novels in Arabic. His most recent novel, Out of the Gutter, was published in Arabic in 2018. Nael is actually more well known actually for his book, Women of Quarantina, which I'm a fan of that novel. Although I have some disagreements with Nael. Nael, he'll say that it's not a dystopian piece of work. He'll say it's a future history, but I still feel it has some dystopia in it. But maybe it's a combination of both, Nael, because we feel like it's maybe we're living Women of Quarantine already in 2021 in Alexandria. But I want to thank you both for making it and offering your time to give your perspectives and your vital insights on this matter that we'll be discussing. So now, maybe what I brought up could be a segue to the question I want to bring up. Do you think perhaps that the idea of the space, the MEU, could be seen as a bit utopian? Or is it something else?
About the lack of censorship, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, like in the idea of, like, for example, I mean, do you see an organizing space in Berlin with potential that maybe that is embodied through the MAU as a sort of a utopian thinking, or is it realistic, or how do you envision it?
I mean, I think like all abstract values, it's a bit utopian, like the complete freedom. There is no any complete freedom, of course, but we have to try to seek it, and we will not gain it, but will not gain it 100%. We will not gain it completely, but at least we can try all the time, and we can achieve more and more freedom rather than maybe the last century, the last decades, maybe. But at least the meaning of being intellectual, or the meaning of being activist, maybe, is just to try with some awareness that you will not achieve it completely, but to try. You will not achieve the complete one, but you will achieve maybe 7%, unlike the 6% you achieved yesterday, something like this. So it's a bit, of course, when we talk about it abstractly, it looks a bit utopian, but there are extents. So we can try at least.
Okay. Orit, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that the attempt to sort of try to write without censorship and using sort of exilic spaces for writing is something that happened historically in sort of Arab intellectual production. Even if we look at the 19th century, Egyptian history, for example. So Yaqub Sanou, a very important Jewish writer of theatrical work, wrote a lot in Paris in exile to try to avoid censorship. Or Mustafa Kamel, the Egyptian national leader, was again in Paris trying to sort of figure out the way to fight British colonialism. And some of these products we know from Egypt, we know from Iraq, during the days of Saddam. We know from the Ottoman Empire during the days of Sultan Abdul Hamid II were actually smuggled back into the Middle East and were quite inspirational. But I think that there's a sort of a hope that in some kind of an exilic or diasporic space, the censorship will disappear. But there's also like the censorship from within. People think about the colonial gaze when they write. Their language hierarchies. Which language is more important? Their language that are imposed on you. Their cultural boundaries that people carry with them. Arab Jews with their complicated relationship to Arabic, even if all political troubles disappear, there are certain cultural, background and stereotyping. So I think that there are like actual borders. There are spaces that we try to strive for, but each of them have limitations because of different gazes, because of different histories, because of different memories. So the attempt is wonderful, and it has in itself a long history in Arab intellectual production, in Arab Jewish intellectual production, but there are limitations, I think.
Okay. No, you do raise good points, Orit. A question I want to ask, which ties in with that, and it's probably the primary question of this discussion, would be after years of censorship and limited movement of literature, limited movement of literature between borders, should I add. How does one write again when everything is suddenly possible? And I mean this in this context of exilic spaces. I'm not sure from your historian's perspective of how unprecedented is the era we live in, but we are living in a very unusual era, which some people might say the post-ideological age, when we really have no frames of references anymore, and we have to sort of existentially make up things again. And there's what the German Korean philosopher Byung-Chul Han would call the sort of the digital storm, where we are in an era of fatigue, where we are overly exposed, and one wonders, how does one make order out of all this chaos? All right, and the man.
I think again the idea of how we write in this era. I think this era is unique, and I think one of the sort of the problems is that it's not just censorship. It's also that there was a particular revolutionary moment in the Middle East, and now we don't know where it's going. And it produced a lot of sort of counter-revolutionaries or counter-ideological moments, a lot of whataboutism. So if you want to comment on something in Syria, you're immediately asked about what's going on in Yemen. If you comment on something in Palestine, you're being asked about something in another space in the Middle East. So I think, again, the limitations have not disappeared. At the same time, I think that, historically speaking, when you have these kind of revolutionary moments, and we can think about 1919 in Egypt, or 1952 in Egypt, or 1908, that was a revolutionary, a constitutional revolution in the Ottoman Empire, or even the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution. There is a moment of kind of cultural production that is carried on later on and cannot disappear and cannot be censored. So 1919 is very important in Egyptian history. It's a major anti-colonial rebellion that inspires the entire Middle East. Then we have a writer like Tawfiq al-Hakim that writes Awdat al-Ruh, that is in conversation with this moment, or later on, years later, Naguib Mahfouz. These events reshape what happens in the 1950s and reconfigured after 1952 when there's another moment. So these moments, I think, are not just about like this boom that happens, that I think happened in Egypt. Like you guys can talk about it much better than I do, but the amazing cultural production that came with Tahrir is incredible, I think, globally. And I think that whatever changes happen in Egypt politically, the works stay. The works are influential, and the works will serve, you know, someone like me in a couple of years or more, that are trying to, do something with them. But again, I think that there's these works they're immediate. They respond to lifting of censorship, to happiness, to a whole new things. But I think that they're always in conversation with something that happened before. Like, I think that, for example, when people in, I don't know, Tahrir carry the images of Kulthum or Suad Hosni or something, they were trying to evoke certain memories. So there's the moment, and then there's kind of the long line. But I think that, you know, the novelist will have better insight.
Yeah, I was actually curious, but thank you, Orit, you raised very good points, and one of them I actually want Nael to flesh out regarding, your role as an author in the context of the literature scene in Egypt, and how it compares for you pre-2011 and post-2011.
I think in the beginning, I would like to refer to 2011, because it was how our bubble as bloggers. Let's say we were bloggers since 2005 till 2011, and then everything exploded. Everything has been shown in TV. Our slogans, I mean, our songs and our obscenity has been shown on TV. So it was very tense moment for everybody in Egypt. Specifically in terms of obscenity, because we used to in blogs, because there's no any editors in blogs. Everybody wrote whatever he wanted. So we are used to this language, to the obscene language, to the naughty words, and we were asking, questioning it, and so on. So till the moment of 2011, when Egyptian society, I mean mothers and fathers in their houses, they became very, very, very shocked, of course. Maybe a bit inspired, maybe, but it was a moment of a shock. It was a great shock for them. Returning to your question, what would be written in after censorship? I remember very well a poem which was published by Gamal Bekhit, a nationalist poet and very respectful one, wears a suit all the time, has a thin mustache like this. So very, very respectful one. So he wrote a very, very obscene poem against Mubarak after 2011. In Arabic, it has a name, Din Abukum Ismu E. It was very obscene because it refers to the religion of your father. When in Egypt, when we curse, the harshest curse is to curse the religion of you and of your mother and of your father and so on. So he used this curse in his poem. In spite he's very respectful. You could never expect this from a poet like that. So I think people just after disappearing of censorship, some people tend to test this, to test the removal of censorship. So am I allowed to say the word X or the word Y? So I begin to use it. So on the other hand, the conservatives say this. I mean, it become it is a bit tension in the society. A lot of teenagers dare for the first time to say the word they were prevented to say in the last years. So the older people see this and feel it very, very harsh and very maybe sometimes artificial. And this is the main critic against using these words. It's artificial. It's not out of themselves. They are imitating somebody else and so on. So I think people, if you are asking what people would say say, what would write after lack of censorship, they would test it. They would test saying naughty words. They would test cursing God, cursing prophets, cursing everything, just to make sure that everything is allowed. Maybe I saw this also in 2019 in Lebanon, in the Lebanese revolution, where a very harsh curse was very common among the revolutionaries. It's not about religion this time, but about the vagina of the mother. It's a very harsh. It's a very harsh word inside the Arab world all over. And it was being used in Lebanon, in Beirut in 2009, about maybe the prime minister, and I don't remember actually, but referring to his mother's vagina. And people were, specifically girls, were a bit uncomfortable with this because it has something masculine in it, referring to, of course. So the revolutionaries began to make theories about using naughty words, claiming that it lost its masculine meaning, but now it's just harsh. It has nothing to do with gender. It's just innocent in this aspect specifically. So I think people will be very, very shocked in the beginning. They will try to test the lack of censorship. They will try to be more cool, maybe more revolutionary. The competition would be about whom will use the most harsh words. So this is, for me, this may be, if we imagine a situation like this, this will last for some years. Maybe aftermath, it will, and everything will get balanced again. But after the harsh reaction in the beginning, So.
Thank you, Nael. What I would say that you allude to basically is that forbidden memories have arisen in such a historical moment. If we can call it forbidden memories. I mean, Orit, what would you have to say on that matter?
Well, I think pretty much following up what was just said, I think the gender will come up in sort of, if we imagine a world where we don't have censorship, then we will hear more voices of women. We will hear more voices of children. But what I think will happen is that it will also give room, and this is something that I've mentioned before, to new interpretations of older works, because we have works that were, said things about very radical things about gender or women's rights or whatever, but then the interpretation kind of brought them back, or processes of canonicity kind of brought them back and said, well, the author really wasn't that radical, and he was, after all, a good Muslim, Christian, Jew, whatever. So I think that a world without censorship will open up new memories and new understanding of older literary works, and at the same time, again, will enable people to talk about certain silenced past. So one of the fields that I work in is the history of Jews from Arab worlds. And especially in Israel, oftentimes it had to be phrased as like, the Arab world was horrible and we were persecuted and thank God we left and so forth. But when you scratch the surface, even under these conditions, you see a lot of nostalgia, a lot of love of music and food and neighbors and friendships that remain despite these conditions. So one imagines that in a world without censorship and so forth, these memories could flourish. People could talk more freely about that. But I think that a world like that would also inspire a new conversation perhaps about politics, not just in literature, but also in literature. Because again, right now, while there's a lot of criticisms of political regimes, some people are always afraid that if you say something, it's going to be weaponized against you by colonizers, by other regimes, and so forth. If there's a space where people could talk genuinely about politics, about regimes without being afraid of regime change or forced intervention, that could also be a very liberating aspect. But I think, again, the most important thing is to create a space where people could talk about things that happen to them in their families, things that happen to them in real life, in university. Now, I also think that some of these things already exist. Like, for example, obscenities, right? So when Nael mentioned these obscenities, I was like, not all, but let's say I know hypothetically some people who said these obscenities in closed rooms, or when they were reading the newspaper at home, or when they were watching TV. What happened, I think, post 2011 is that they moved from the private space or the spaces that were considered, because of class issues and things like that, lowbrow into highbrow, into TV and so forth. So I think that something also happens between, private public boundaries that is quite important. And again, finally, one thing that came to mind is that people can talk about religion in a more thoughtful way, on sort of, criticizing certain things without being considered a heretic and things like that. But also, on the other hand, talking about love of religion and culture and religiosity without being considered backwards or supporting the sort of conservative political organizations. That religiosity can be sort of liberated from these polarizing perceptions that I think are quite limiting. And I think if you look at the sport production, if you look at literature, if you look at how people engage with like Islamic sources, Christian sources, Jewish sources, the engagements of intellectuals, of writers and so forth is much richer than what we see in politics and in media. And I think that that is something that will continue again, if we're imagining new spaces. So that I think will be important too.
Well, I want to ask you both questions, and thank you for that, Orit, because it actually, what you said sparked a thought in me regarding the idea of literature moving across borders. So the question I wanted to ask was, what are the possibilities for a flow of literature without borders and censorship? But I don't want to make it that easy either, okay? So the question is that if we were to play devil's advocate, one could say that repression has produced creativity and artistry that might not have been possible without these sort of restrictions, because it forced the writer and the artist and the thinker into a certain space to not say the obvious as obvious. This is one thought. I remember reading an article, and the title of it was written by a Czech writer, and it was written, I think, a decade ago. And basically the title was, what does the Czech Republic stand for anymore? And the idea was that after Václav Havel and after, they were repressed and they were imprisoned, at the time during the communist era, but they were also able to put out great playwrights and poems and essays, and not to justify repression, of course, but one asks, when they've been given this neoliberal freedom, as problematic as it is, of course, what does the new author stand for? And so maybe we could translate that into a Middle Eastern context, that if there were flourishing democracies, that will happen, and we do hope it happens across the region, what would be the effects on writers and novelists? We'd like to hear that from you, Orit, and Nael. Take it. Who wants to take it is free to take it.
Or maybe Nael should start as a novelist.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I have two examples in my mind, two personal examples in my mind. The first of them is about Women of Quarantina, the novel I published in 2013, but it was almost written in 2011, before the revolution. Then came the revolution, and I didn't finish. I just waited for 2 or 3 months to finish it, to write the last chapters. So I mean, I made the most of the work before the revolution, but it was published after the revolution. The interesting phase for me, the phase I want to talk about is while I edited the novel. The revolution happened actually, and the novel is a futuristic one, one which talks about Alexandria in the next decades. So I couldn't avoid or neglect the revolution. I couldn't. I felt a big urge to insert some words about the revolution inside the novel, although it wasn't the main theme about the main theme of the novel or something like this. But I felt the urge. I can't simply neglect some major happening like revolution. So I inserted some sentences, some slogans, some words about the revolution. Now I regret it. Now I regret this because it wasn't the main aim of the novel. I just were influenced by the moment. So I just put them very quickly. So I don't like this. I feel maybe literature, unlike everything else, literature depends on being slow. Depends on time, more and more time, on patience. Unlike, for example, unlike journalism, unlike a lot of things else. So maybe I should wait more time, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, to just reconsider inserting these words or such a thing. My second example is the second novel, Out of the Gutter. Okay, in the first draft, I use a lot of naughty words. Yeah, maybe it was how I feel inspired inside the process of writing itself. A lot of naughty words, a lot of obscene scenes, and so on. While it's a very technical thing, but I should explain it. You can say everything in Fusha, in the standard Arabic, okay? But when you talk specifically about the intimate organs of body in colloquial, in Ammiya, in your dialect, it would be considered immediately very obscene. You can say them in standard Arabic, but not in colloquial Ammiya in Egypt, or maybe in a lot of other Arab countries. So my trick was to use the actual words, the naughty words and so on. But while editing, I began to notice this word, this colloquial word, doesn't work here in this context. So I began to remove it, to replace it with the Fusha word, which works more better for me, for the context, for the personality, how the character thinks or speaks or whatever. Yeah. So I begin with the urge to challenge censorship. Okay. Aftermath, while editing, while being more patient, I begin to reconsider it. This colloquial word might work. This colloquial word might work in this context, but it doesn't work in the other one. Yeah, so that's how I think about it. So that's why I say that I think for the very first moments of lack of censorship, people will begin to use all their naughty or obscene vocabulary, okay, without being genuine, and they will not look as genuine, and they will be accused of being not genuine, okay. But for me, it's a very necessary phase to proceed to the other one, to begin to think, to begin to feel comfortable, as Orit said, to begin to feel comfortable that this obscene word works here, but doesn't work here. This how I understand being comfortable with language or with the words and so on. In the beginning, we will not feel comfortable. We'll feel the big urge to challenge and to destroy and so on. But we should pass this to feel comfortable aftermath. That's what I think about it. Yeah.
I think that.
Sorry, go on, right, please.
Yeah, I think that like this idea about oppression producing literature, on the one hand, it's a very romantic idea, right? Like I don't know, young Werther and so forth. But at the same time, I think that it does have a particular kind of merit. I mean, when I'm thinking, for example, about Palestinian literature, right? So if you think about the poetry of Mahmoud Darwish, if you think about the writing of a novelist like Ghassan Kanafani, obviously, it doesn't come from a liberal democratic moment. It comes from an idea that literature should motivate you and revolutionize you, but also it comes from a great oppression. I mean, Ghassan Kanafani is an author that was assassinated because of his politics, and I think the many merits of of his works, but also some of its shortcomings, is precisely because it's about galvanizing and so forth. There's also, I think, a literature, and this is something that authors on Lebanese literature have commented on, that in times of like civil war and a complete collapse of the state, that also gives you a particular kind of freedom. So scholars like Miriam Cook and others commented on the fact that, you know, during the 80s and the 90s, we had like this amazing writing on gender and on women and so forth in Lebanon, with also obscenities, with sex scenes and things like that, that we wouldn't necessarily, that we didn't anticipate, precisely because the entire system collapsed. And so there was no sort of a leader or a voice, that the whole thing was in shambles. But at the same time, it seems that, you know, this idea of world without border is very enticing. But as Nael said, like, you know, there are language hierarchies. People from the Middle East who live in Germany or in the United States find difficulties even having their own children speaking Arabic or Persian or Turkish, and reading the works that are relevant to them. You know, there are language hierarchies. It's more profitable to speak in one language. You sometimes think about which language your work will be translated into, and what does that mean? And so I think that obviously, you know, you can overcome censorship. Things could be smuggled to the Middle East, and there are a lot of potentialities, but there are certain power relations that remain even when borders and censorship and all that are lifted, inshallah. So, you know, that's also something that I think we should be talking about. And the last thing I think is that sometimes, 2 points. One is that there isn't always a correlation between great literature and great politics. Some of the great poets that I know from Iraq, for example, had politics that I'm like, you know, and some had fantastic politics and were persecuted because of them, and were progressives and radical and leftists and so forth. So that's one thing to remember. The second is that, and this also has to do with something that Nael mentioned about like the difficulties about writing about the present and the future when they keep changing, is that there's also a very prominent genre in Arabic literature, which is the historical novel, from Georgi Zaidan to Gamal al-Ghitani. And so one way of actually thinking about the dystopian and the political and the present is going back to the past and kind of retelling the past. And it could be, you know, how God created the world in Naguib Mahfouz, or it could be the Mamluk sultans in Egypt in the 13th and 14th century, or it could be, I don't know, what the Abbasids being reimagined in the 19th century. So sometimes actually a very peculiar present makes you think about the past very differently. And I think that that's why and because of censorship and because of these moments, why Arabic literature produced incredible historical novels, I think, especially in Egypt.
Excellent, thank you for that, Orit. You actually reminded me of Solzhenitsyn's profile when he began to take on very pro-Russian, like nationalist positions before he died in the 2000s, even supporting annexation former Soviet territory. I found that really interesting, given his position as a former prisoner and living in the Gulag, and yet being a great writer and then taking on these questionable political views. Also, mentioning Mahmoud Darwish, it really blows my mind the amount of beautiful poetry that he can produce as one poet. And it just shows you that the metaphysical blueprint of his thought is rage, in the sense that everything from the Nakba and the whole Palestinian narrative has made him this, with all the trauma that comes with it, has made him this superb poet. I wanted to raise a question slightly unrelated and related to Nael. So you brought up a few times regarding profanity and swear words, we move in similar circles, and so I noticed this surge in the use of profanity in Cairo and Alexandria and that, but I have questions about when it translates into literature, not because it shouldn't or shouldn't, but it should or shouldn't, but I'm just reminded of a different, say, analogy. If we look at the stand-up comedy scene in the United States, so, one of the earliest stand-up comedians to use profanity publicly was Richard Pryor in the late 1970s. And he pulled it off well, though, okay? And then it was followed by Eddie Murphy in the 1980s, and Chris Rock did not bad of it in the 1990s. But then a lot of audiences were complaining that it just became too much by the 2000s, that it, rather than just being a strategic word that was dropped, it just became excessive, that the F word was thrown around everywhere and anywhere, that it became like the defining feature of comedy. So what I don't know what the initial, perhaps the initial breakout was to break out of the previous 1970s norms and show that this word can be said. But then it just becomes like, okay, let's just vomit it out every moment, at every time, etc. So, I mean, I don't know like how this links to political freedoms, or is this just like some sort of social explosion because of, previous repression? It's a scenario that fascinates me, but if you want to comment, that would be great.
So I don't have an answer for you. Just think about it. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine.
I'm sorry, but I want just to add to Orit about something she said about historical novels. Because I think they're very, very, very trendy in Egypt right now, just because to avoid speaking about present. Just to avoid speaking about, people goes to the Mamluki era, to the Ottoman era, and so on, just because you are not allowed simply to talk about present. Because there's some a bit tension. Nasrists in Egypt, or nationalists, or whatever, they tend all the time to the Mamluki era, while the Islamists tend to the Ottoman era. So you find a whole debate between Mamluki and Ottoman era, which doesn't and people are very, very, very excited to fight against each other, and you don't know what to do with all that, because it's just a fight about the present, but nobody declares it. Nobody declares. Yeah, of course, it's because Turkey and because in the Mamluki era, Egypt was an independent empire and so on, while in the Ottoman era it was just a dependent one to Turkey. But nobody says that. Nobody says that. You can find a lot of actual op-eds in newspapers speak about Toman Bay and Selim al-Awwal, which the fight which happened 500 years ago, without declaring what the context. So I want to add just one notice about a TV show which was screened some 3 years ago, and it was actually about the present. It was very, very accurate about the present. How young people very accurately speak and behave and so on. It was called Sabi' Gar, by the way, but without any word about the revolution, without any word, which was very, very, very strange, because everybody speaks about the revolution, which happened 10 years ago, indeed, but still everybody speaks about it. At least I'm sure from 3 years ago when the TV show was screened. And that this TV show was censored also, but not out of political reasons this time, but about, it was because of some scenes where a young woman smokes hash, maybe, or speaks about drugs, or speaks about alcohol and so on. So it was censored, and it was without any word about politics, but it's also censored, maybe because you are not allowed to speak about present. If you speak very freely about present, about the present moment, you will not, on the first hand, you will not be able to avoid revolution and avoid all the story about revolution, and you will not be able to avoid how girls, for example, how girls begin to take off their hijab, how girls begin to smoke, how girls begin to sit in coffee shops to hang up with young men, and every slight reference of this makes shock to shocks the conservative society. Despite that, this happens very, very, very clearly in the Cairene street and in the Egyptian streets and so on. So I'm sorry for interrupting, but this was about his historical novels, and then back to the present.
Quickly add, Nael, about my previous point, it was more of a comment than a question. So it was more like just I saw that overlap happening between these scenes in the US and Egypt. But perhaps on your point that you just mentioned, perhaps people don't want to read something about the present because there is, I think a lot of people read for a form of escapism. And so if you do...
They speak about it. Yeah. Speak about it, you will...
Yep. Sorry, continue. No, I was just saying that if you bring an escapism, a form of escapism, if they're reading something about the present, it might be just too close to home, but when you bring something, even if it has a nostalgic tinge, even if it has a romanticized dimension to it, maybe that's the pull factor for a reader. It's like it's like
I think you're right. You're right. By the way, you're right. Yeah, in some aspects you're right, because people are, at least young readers, are very bored of mentioning the revolution. Okay, in novels or in films. Yeah, you have a point here, but at least when talking about very current Egyptian society, refer to it with just one word when the revolution happened, at least to make the sense of the present. It doesn't mean that you have to focus on it. No, just refer to it. Everybody refers to it in the streets, in the houses and so on. Just refer to it. It was very strange that it lacked any mentioning of it.
The late Ahmed Khalid Tawfiq, when he was the Egyptian novelist, so when he was asked 6 years ago on a TV show, he said, because the TV host didn't understand why his literature was very popular, and because he writes horror fiction and Gothic horror, and he said to him, why would the youth of the Middle East read your books if they are steeped in a region of horror? Why would they go read books about horror? And he gave him a very interesting reply. He says that when you read horror books, you realize that your horror is not as bad as the horror in the books. It's actually worse than the books. So you think, okay, maybe my life is not so bad. So it's kind of like the lesser of two bad things, I wanted to throw this to Orit. Regarding the Middle East Union, what are the interactions that you see that will be created, that are created or will be created as a cultural space and political structure of the MAU?
I just want to comment on the history before.
Oh, sorry, please.
Then,
sure.
Go ahead.
My apologies.
No, it's fine. We're just floating. I think I'll start with an anecdote. I met when I was in graduate school, I met a colleague of mine, and I said that today, we covered a very important, crucial debate in Egyptian history. And he was like, so what was it? I said, we discussed whether the first powerful 19th century Ottoman governor of Egypt should be called Mehmet Ali Pasha because he was more Ottoman, or should we call him Muhammad Ali Pasha because he was more Egyptian? And the guy looked at me and said, yeah, that's very important. I was like, no, there are articles. So, sometimes what matters to some people matters very little to others. And I think some of these novelists, as Nael said, do pick up on like things that, are very important if you are sort of thinking about the Mamluks or if you're thinking, or how you're thinking about Ottoman Egypt, that I think also have to do with how people think about contemporary Turkey and how people think about occupation and so forth. But it depends also which kind of past you're describing, because if you describe a thing, and I'm not familiar with everything that is published right now, but there are certain moments in like the region's history in the period between World War II, between the two world wars, the Nakba, the resistance to colonialism and so forth, that are deeply meaningful to the present. And so one novel that comes to mind, there's a Palestinian novelist called Ala Hlayhel, and he wrote a novel called Au revoir Akka that is about sort of Napoleon's siege on Akka. So on the one hand, it's, Jazar Pasha, super gore. There's a profession there of a guy who impales people, and I will not repeat the Arabic verb because then I will join Nael's profanities. But it's a very powerful novel, and obviously the guy read, the literature and Jabarti and Gabarti. I'm talking to Egyptians, and all this and all this literature. But at the same time, it's clear that he's talking about sort of failed revolutions and kind of local authoritarian regimes on the one hand, and colonialism on the other. And just like the people of Akka are stuck between Jazar Pasha and Napoleon, you sort of feel that he's saying we're stuck too. And so I also think it depends on the kind of narrative, the period, so some of it is total escapism. And let's not talk about the present because, who was hung in Babizuela is so important right now. And it's clearly political, but some of it actually has potential. And I think, again, I'm thinking about Naguib Mahfouz. He was stabbed because of a particular historical interpretation that he presented. And his own stabbing was interpreted and so forth. In terms of what this particular festival has done and the spaces that it's created, I think it's wonderful. I think it's not only a repetition, not only an invention of something new, but it's also kind of a repetition of the spaces that Paris and Berlin and other cities used to be for various intellectuals in the Middle East for various creations. It also makes me sad a little bit because I'm thinking if the fact that the kind of European diasporic emerges as the local Middle Eastern hub, what does it say about the Middle East? But I'm super excited about these potentials. So.
No, but you're right, Orit. I would say that these diasporic spaces do emerge, but they do sort of synergize back with the original homelands and region. Like the Jews did in the US post-1930s with Europe and Latin American intellectuals who fled the dictatorships in the 70s and 80s, did so who were in Paris, but went back eventually, a lot of them anyway, to Central South America to help rebuild. Although the situation is not that great now, but the overall idea is there that the exilic return and rebuilding and all that. But yeah, Nael, would you have any thoughts on the idea of the MAU?
Yeah, about I think for me, I'm sorry, returning back to the historical novels in Egypt. One of them was, I'm sorry,
Okay,
so sorry,
we can stick to that too if you want.
with this idea, you know, but I think some of them
I can see
are
probably
very,
both
very,
of you.
I didn't deny that some of them were very, very, very good. Specifically, I want to refer specifically to Zini Barakat by Jamal Al-Ghitani, okay, because it refers it's super novel, but it's the one which established the fight between Mamlukis and Ottoman. Al-Ghitani was a very, very nationalist guy. So he thought about the Mamluki defeat by Ottomans as 67 defeat by Israelis. So he began to apply the history to his contemporary trauma, maybe, but in a very, very powerful novel. Yeah. So that's what I want just to add. By the way, can I add some notes that maybe censorship, for me, it always comes from good reasons, or claim good reasons. So the Stalinistic censorship was about the revolution. It was the revolutionary censorship against bourgeois and against maybe. So it's not nowadays there is a kind of political correctness which say that you cannot say the word X because it humiliates somebody else, which is true. It humiliates them, but it's censorship in the same time. I mean, it's more complicated than I thought in the beginning. It can convince you because a lot of people, referring to the beginning of your talk, Orit, because there is no voice for women, for example. There is no voices for maybe for Arab Jews and so on. Let's imagine when this kind of feminist revolution, when in the first phase it will prevent any other. Of course, I think it will tend to question the masculine narratives, of course, and then the most radical between them will tend to ban. I mean, and it will look for good reasons. So maybe we have to be very aware to it. Do we want complete freedom? Okay, which means freedom of right wing, of nasty people, of the people who voted for Trump, for example, for white rubbish. Do we want this? Okay, and then happens what happens, or do we want noble reasons? We want noble things. For me, I want complete freedom. For me, but I'm aware it will look very, very ugly, specifically in the beginning. So maybe that's what it's just what I wanted to add. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, right now we have this whole debate about. I don't think we're there in the Middle East, but right now in the United States or and also I think there in the Middle East is problematic. But when you think about what's happening right now in the United States, where you have all sorts of anti-vaxxers and anti-science people that are putting, things on the internet that, in kind of a very weird interpretation of liberalism, that it's their right not to wear a mask and not to have solidarity, or even to say that you have a cheap if you get a vaccine and all sorts of non-scientific nonsense, then, you know, that's also a price. But I think that, you know, they're also in the Middle East, and this, I think, has to do with something that now is a different kind of censorship. There's kind of a censorship in your face that is like, you are not allowed to criticize the leader or so forth. But a lot of the censorship is never drafted as stifling voices, right? It's protecting the revolution, it's protecting the nation, it's protecting women's honor, it's preventing incitement, it's whatever. So obviously, you know, there's been work, and so there's been work, for example, by Israeli novelist David Grossman on censorship in his book, The Yellow Wind, on censorship of in Israel in Palestinian jails, and like how erratic it could be. Like there was a story there, I believe, about someone who doesn't like Tolkien. So the Palestinian prisoner cannot read The Hobbit or whatever because the censor decided that Tolkien is a very dangerous incitement for something. So sometimes it's erratic, it's just a question of power. But sometimes it's also important how people write under conditions of censorship because it's framed in a particular way. So you have to do many things. And again, it has a history. As a historian in the 19th century and early 20th century, there were authors who wrote, let's say, a journal that was called The Garden, and it was closed down by the government. So they reopened it and called it the Garden of Flowers or something like that, or the Light. So they called it the Light of the East. So people dealt with censorship, and people overcame censorship, and people played with censorship historically, and it inspired certain interesting creations, whether it's historical novels or very coded words. Whether when the censorship is lifted, there's kind of an explosion or fear or this kind of inner limitations that we impose on ourselves. I think it's difficult to tell, but actually these kind, for me at least, as a kind of somebody who's not involved in production but consumes it, the moments after 2011 were fascinating. I mean, in theater, in street, in drama, in everything, in novels, in poems, in the language that changed, in the Amiyah that changed, in the media that changed, the bloggers that became the whatever. So now I'm thinking, like, right now we're all a bit more than a bit depressed, but somehow I'm thinking these works will remain. They're with us. They can't be taken away, right?
Orit, you remind me of my pre-2011 days doing a master's in Middle East studies, because I think any MA students and BA student prior to 2011 studying Middle East studies will probably agree it was quite boring, like in the sense of you're dealing with the same, you're dealing with the same faces. You're talking about Mubarak or Gaddafi, or this Gaddafi was a bit interesting from a personality perspective. Ben Ali, etc. Like things were so stale by the 2000s that you had to really focus more on earlier periods rather than so much the latter periods. So we're looking at a nationalization of Nasser, etc. and all of this. But it wasn't like, compared to what happens after 2011, there was an explosion in knowledge production that it was difficult to keep up with what was coming out, and events and workshops and paintings and theater plays. And it was just like, it was something that was bottled up and it just came out. And that is one of the fruits of 2011 for all the crisis and problems and downward spiral. There has been that effect where you have this sort of new generation of thinkers who many I'm sure have left as well, but they're there, their ideas are there. And we haven't seen what began, I think, in 2011. We have not seen its end yet. I think something is still unfolding, and we're in the midst of a storm, and we have not seen the light yet at the end of the tunnel, but we could still say it's somewhere there.
But I also think there's also something, at least in my position, that is elitist, right? Because if somebody today is a refugee, a Syrian refugee, everywhere in the world, in Syria itself, in Turkey, in Germany. I can talk for a whole day about the meaning of exilic production and Said and Adorno and all that. These folks lost their homes, their lives, relatives, everything because of this. So I think it's also important to remember like the limitations, right?
No, of course. I mean, like we're all in different positions and with various privileges. Of course, the Syrian should be speaking on the Syrian role. When I speak to many Syrian activists in Berlin, for example, refugees, and they will say that, I mean, I don't ask them this question, but in the discourse often is that they don't regret the Syrian revolution. They're very pro-Syrian revolution, and it had to happen. Of course, they're upset and angry at the international reaction and Russia and Iran and all these actors, and of course Assad above all. But for them, they're producing brilliant short films and not to romanticize it. It's not like they're doing it then with a smile as well. It's a very, very difficult struggle. And for me, and I think we also have to be careful of me and Nael have to also be careful of our Egypt-centric perspective of Dunya that could also cloud everything else in the region. And it takes a lot of unlearning to do that, by the way. And to realize, yes, there's other equal Arab countries with, grievances and hopes and aspirations that don't have to be about Egypt. Yeah. But I think it's a really crucial question, because this is really the idea of the conversation is what can exilic spaces do in their respective space, and what can they do back in relation to the home countries?
I think, and I share with you a lot of thoughts about Syrian revolution and so on. Yeah, I mean, Egypt inspired a lot of revolutions all over the Arab world and so on, which ended not very beautiful in a beautiful way, but it has to be done. I mean, we are not responsible for the results. It has to be done. I'm a bit confused about if somebody asked me before a Western guy asked me, do you regret being in Tahrir Square out of Daesh, out of ISIS, and so I don't know, but at least in the cities in Egypt, I see the difference. I see specifically when talking about the women. I mean, for me, the Egyptian revolution success with just two exceptions in economics and in politics, but in society terms, it's success. Yeah, I mean, I see this with my eyes, and I don't regret it just out of this reason. And I think when I got out to Tahrir Square, I thought about, of course I sat down with Mubarak and so on, but I thought about society. I thought about people I'm seeing every day more than I thought about Mubarak and about politics. That's what I thought. I remember in the early 2000s, for example, it was you are not allowed to say the word secular, for example, when defining yourself, when defining myself as a secular. I'm not allowed. There is no, but it's not allowed. I'm not sure about my pronunciation. The hegemony was for Islamists in the street. It was Mubarak from Mubarak upstairs and Islamists downstairs, and nothing else. So saying you are secular may mean that you are pro-Mubarak, for example. And we know a lot of examples about it. Saying you are pro-woman means you are pro-Suzanne Mubarak. So this changed very, very radically because of 2011. It was a big explosion, okay? And due to that, okay, due to the explosion was outside of ourselves. We couldn't predict the results because it's much bigger than we thought about. So our enemies used our techniques in 2011, returning back to 2000. It was just imitating the techniques, the slogans, the jokes, the stories, the tone, everything was just imitated, but without spirit. That's what I claim. Without something was dull. Was dull in 2013 in the revolution or coup in 2013. So that's why I mean claiming freedom, giving freedom to all the people, including right wing, including your enemies. And I don't regret that. I don't regret that because when imitating you look dull. You are the one who started it, so you have the freedom to maybe you have the freedom to change your techniques, to change to change your jokes, to change your tone. But the people who imitated you will be forever imitating you. Will be imitating you because you are the one. You are the one who started it. I'm sorry, maybe it's a bit vague in my mind, but I hope you understand at least something.
Okay, just saw the message. So, I wanted to say, okay, Nael, I actually have to, I do agree with you. And I think when someone asks the question, do you regret 2011? It really assumes that revolutions have an on and off switch, that you can just decide to do a revolution tomorrow or not. I mean, it doesn't work that way, and it's a much more of a collective matter. And I think people just really forget how bad things were before 2011. Just because it got worse later on a different track doesn't mean we can be nostalgic about a pre-2011 past, which was very, very dark. It's just forgotten because of the bigger mess that came after the moderate mess, if you want to call it. But it's a really a question. I think it's going to be unfolding. And I think the idea of exilic spaces and the idea that, what next? I think that's really the crucial question. What next? We're not prophets, we're not visionaries, but the best we can do within our respective fields is to sort of chart imaginative possibilities, alternatives, because we would wholeheartedly agree that the status quo is not sustainable. And we live in a very post-utopian era. Like, utopia has got such a bad name because of the 20th century. And it's not the fault of utopia. It just was misused, But, I think through your respective works as historians, as novelists, as writers, even translators, which comes with a lot of responsibility, that there is a need to say, perhaps we can pull out this work, this thinker from the 19th century who said this thing, or this poem, or this metaphor that can be a guide or just make an incremental contribution to something better than what it is now. Yeah. So, I mean, this is kind of my conclusive wrap up. If you have any thoughts, please do throw it at me or throw it at us.
I think that there is something very hopeful about a exilic production that is, committed and about the present. I was thinking that during the years of Trump in the United States, my escapism was something that we talked about before, science fiction, things that are not about the present. So there's something very, very hopeful about this 2011 moment. And as you said, we shouldn't forget it. And I think exilic spaces do encourage it. And again, there's such a rich theorizing about Adorno in particular, right? Like how the exile liberates you, that you're not committed to states and institutions, and you have the ability to become sort of the ideal critic. And this is something that Edward Said worked on, and others in the Jewish context. Sort of Amnon Krakotskian wrote about sort of the exilic Jew that was kind of the core anxiety of Zionism. as an alternative. So I do see a lot of potentialities. But again, coming from, I work at the University of Chicago, so it's interesting for me to talk about the exilic as liberating. But I also, looking around me, there are folks that, try to make it to ends meet, trying to figure out where they work and how they'll get the money for tomorrow and so forth. So it's not a sort of critique the wonderful intellectual production. I just put it a little bit in perspective. And I think that that both of you are right, that, if the conclusion should not be that the status quo is sacred, or that any move that is progressive will inevitably lead to something worse, because that's sort of impossible to live by, and impossible to envision the future, and to live in the present.
I just have to say, based on when you brought up the anti-vaxxers, I have to say, on behalf of the Middle East, like, for all the craziness of the Middle East, we don't have anti-vaxxer protests. It's just not a phenomenon. It's just, we have so many more important things to worry about.
The product of not having the vaccine.
And yeah,
not the anti-vaccine needs more education.
But I think, if you don't have anything else to add, I can wrap it up now, but I really, really appreciate it. I myself learned a lot from both of you, and you're in a very critical field, and I'm really happy when there's a sort of a symbiosis of ideas happening in these Zoom chats. It would be great to do it physically, but hopefully, inshallah, when this pandemic is officially over, we can all meet for coffee and have a discussion with a real live audience. So, in physical and 3D flesh and blood.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you, Nael.
Thank you very, very much. This is so exciting. Thank you.
Bye.
Assalamu bye.
Bye.
Assalamu.
Come, imagine with us.